So, Prince William just did something the palace usually never does. He reportedly moved to quietly reshape the future architecture of the monarchy in a way that directly boxes Camilla out of the long-term picture, and he did it without warning her, without consulting her office, and according to those briefed on the meeting, without even looping in his father until the decision was essentially already made. And the reason is honestly more personal than anyone expected. Because we're not talking about a minor scheduling dispute or a polite disagreement about a patronage handover. We're talking about the future king drawing a line in the sand about who gets to shape the next reign, and that line reportedly runs straight through the queen's chair at the table. That's not palace politics as usual. That's not institutional caution. That's a generational power shift happening in real time. And if the reporting holds, it's the single most consequential move William has made since becoming Prince of Wales. Before we get into it, if you're new here on Crown Watch, hit subscribe so you don't miss the updates on this one, because this story is genuinely still unfolding, and the palace hasn't finished reacting to what William put in motion. There are 3 more shoes waiting to drop, and when they do, I want you here for it. So let's talk about what actually happened here, because the timeline is pretty revealing when you lay it all out. According to sources familiar with the internal discussions, the flashpoint began earlier this year during a series of quiet meetings at Windsor about what insiders call the transition architecture. That's the internal palace term for the working plan that governs how duties, patronages, and ceremonial roles get redistributed when a new monarch takes the throne. A royal patronage, by the way, is a formal association between a member of the royal family and a charity or organization. And those patronage are one of the most valuable pieces of currency inside the firm because they define your public identity for decades. The meetings reportedly started around 9 in the morning at Windsor. Small, closed, no phones. Just William, his principal private secretary, and 2 senior aides who've been with him since his Kensington Palace days. And here's where it gets interesting. According to palace observers, Camilla's team was not in the room, not on the agenda, not even copied on the briefing note that circulated afterward. That's the detail that changes everything, because in a normal transition, the Queen Consort's office is one of the first stops. Her patronages, her ceremonial calendar, her role in state occasions, all of that is supposed to be discussed collaboratively. That didn't happen here. Instead, insiders describe William walking his team through what he reportedly called a streamlining plan. The idea, according to those briefed on the discussion, is to consolidate the working royals into a much tighter core, with a clear delineation between the reigning generation and the incoming one. On paper, that sounds like sensible modernization. In practice, it reportedly means that when William becomes king, Camilla's role would shrink dramatically. She would retain her title and her personal patronages, but her institutional influence, the part that actually shapes decisions, would effectively end the moment the crown passes. I know that sounds incredibly technical and boring, but stay with me because it's actually the key to the whole story. Because there's a specific palace convention called continuity of consort influence. It's the informal understanding that a queen consort or a queen dowager retains soft power inside the household even after her husband's reign ends, particularly on matters of family, charity, and public messaging. It's the reason the late Queen Mother had a voice in palace decisions for decades after George VI died. What William reportedly proposed effectively rewrites that convention. And here's the thing, the timing matters. This wasn't floated 10 years from now as a theoretical plan. According to sources, the framework was drafted with a specific figure attached, reportedly a review point set for within the next 24 months. That's not a vague long-term vision, that's a working timeline. Sources familiar with the discussions describe an internal document, no more than 11 pages, that outlines the new structure in precise language. A senior aide reportedly placed that folder on the desk of the king's principal private secretary in early spring, and it sat there for nearly a week before Charles was fully briefed on its contents. Now here's where the contradiction starts to emerge between what William was projecting publicly and what was actually happening behind closed doors. Because in public, William has been careful, warm, respectful, deferential to his father, polite to Camilla at every joint engagement. He stood beside her at services, walked behind her at state events, and never once let a flicker of tension show on camera. And honestly, that's hard to argue with. That's exactly what a future king is supposed to do. Institutional loyalty is the whole job. But somewhere along the way, that public choreography started to diverge sharply from what William was actually building in private. According to insiders, he's been quietly having what one source described as long conversations with his own team about what the monarchy needs to look like in 10, 20, 30 years. And in those conversations, Camilla reportedly does not feature as a strategic voice. She features as a chapter that closes when Charles's reign closes. That's a pretty stark shift from the tone of the last 2 years, when the palace worked overtime to establish her as a fully integrated, fully respected consort. And I understand that instinct too. William watched his mother's marriage collapse under the weight of the very woman who now sits beside his father as queen. That's not ancient history for him. That's the emotional wallpaper of his entire childhood. So the idea that he would want to define his own reign on his own terms, with his own wife beside him, and no lingering shadow from the previous chapter, that's not vindictive, that's human. Anyone who watched their mother go through what Diana went through would have complicated feelings about the woman who eventually took her place. But here's the thing. Camilla is not just a personal figure to William. She's an institutional one now. She was crowned. She holds the title of queen. She has spent nearly 2 decades building patronages, championing causes like domestic abuse survivors and literacy, and reportedly working harder than almost anyone else in the family to earn the public's grudging acceptance. And that work, according to those close to her, has been the defining project of her later life. So when William reportedly signals that all of that ends the day Charles dies, it doesn't just affect Camilla. It sends a message to every institution she's touched, every charity that carries her name, every survivor who spoke at an event because she convinced them their story mattered. And that's where the third-party ripple starts to show up, because it's not just Camilla feeling this. Her office, reportedly, is quietly bracing for what one aide described as a very difficult few years. Her children from her first marriage, who have always been kept at arm's length from royal life, are reportedly worried about what happens to their mother's public standing when she no longer has the protection of Charles's reign. And Charles himself, according to those briefed on the situation, is caught in the middle of the 2 people he loves most, watching his son quietly dismantle the future he'd hoped to secure for his wife. There's a moment that reportedly captures all of this. It happened in a small sitting room at Clarence's house, late afternoon, curtains half drawn. Charles was reading through a summary of the streamlining proposal, glasses pushed down his nose, the folder open on his lap. Camilla was in the room too, sitting across from him in one of the armchairs she favors, a cup of tea gone cold beside her. According to insiders, Charles didn't say anything for a long time. He just kept turning the pages. And when he finally looked up, he reportedly reached across and placed his hand briefly over hers, and told her, in his quiet way, that he would handle it, that he wouldn't let this stand. She reportedly didn't say anything back. She just nodded once and looked at the window. That moment changed everything inside that household, because Charles, according to sources, walked out of that room and made a phone call that same evening. Not to William, to a senior figure at Buckingham Palace who has known both men their entire lives. And what he reportedly asked was whether there was any way to slow the proposal down, to force it back into a proper consultation process, to give Camilla's office a seat at the table before anything became irreversible. The answer, according to those briefed on the call, was not encouraging. Because William, as Prince of Wales and heir apparent, has the constitutional standing to shape his own future reign, and once he's built the framework, undoing it becomes politically much harder than stopping it in the first place. And here's the thing that I honestly can't stop thinking about. William reportedly knew Charles would find out. He knew his father would be hurt. He knew Camilla would feel ambushed. And he made the choice to proceed anyway. That's not carelessness. That's a decision made with full understanding of the emotional cost, which tells you how strongly he feels about what he's protecting. According to those familiar with his thinking, William believes the monarchy cannot survive another decade of what he views as the drift of the last reign. He wants a leaner, more disciplined, more clearly focused institution. And in his view, that requires drawing a hard line between his father's chapter and his own. So why did William do this now, and why did he do it this way? According to palace observers, the answer comes down to leverage. Right now, Charles is still on the throne, still setting the tone of the current reign, still able to elevate Camilla's profile at every state occasion. If William waits until he's king to make these changes, he'll face two problems. First, he'll be accused of dishonoring his father's memory. Second, Camilla will have had years more to entrench herself institutionally, making any rollback look cruel. By moving now, quietly, through structural planning rather than public statement, William reportedly avoids both traps. He gets to shape the next reign without ever having to publicly criticize the current one. That's not nothing. That's genuinely sophisticated institutional strategy from a man who, 10 years ago, was still finding his footing as a working royal. And it tells you something about how much he's grown into the role of heir apparent. He's not the reactive, emotional prince he was in the aftermath of his mother's death. He's a much more calculating figure now, and that calculation is what makes this so unsettling for Camilla's team. The confrontation, when it finally happened, reportedly took place at Windsor. According to sources, William traveled down to see his father in person, at Charles's request, on a gray afternoon in late spring. The meeting was held in one of the smaller studies, the kind with a fireplace and two facing chairs, and very little else. Charles was reportedly already seated when William arrived, wearing a dark suit, no tie, a small stack of papers on the table beside him. William reportedly sat opposite, one leg crossed over the other, hands folded in his lap. Neither man raised his voice, according to those briefed on the meeting. That's not how they fight in silences and long sentences. Charles reportedly began by asking his son directly whether he understood what this proposal would do to Camilla. Not to her title, not to her calendar, but to her. To the woman who had stood beside him through decades of public hostility, who had held his hand through his mother's death, who had waited longer than any consort in modern memory to be accepted. William reportedly listened. And then he said, in the paraphrased account provided by sources, that he wasn't trying to hurt Camilla. He was trying to protect the institution. He said the monarchy could not afford to carry unresolved questions about the previous reign into the next one, and that he owed it to his own children to give them a clean start. Charles reportedly took his glasses off at that point. He set them on the table very carefully, the way he does when he's trying not to let his hands shake. And he told his son, according to those familiar with the exchange, that Camilla had spent 20 years earning her place in that family, and that treating her like a chapter to be closed was not just unfair, it was a betrayal of everything Charles had tried to build. William reportedly didn't retreat, he said, and this is the paraphrase that reportedly stopped the room, that he had spent his entire adult life watching his father choose Camilla over everything else, and he wasn't going to let his own reign be defined by the same choice. That's a pretty remarkable admission from a future king, if the reporting is accurate, because what William reportedly said isn't just about institutional streamlining. It's about a wound that never fully closed. It's about a son who has spent decades performing acceptance in public while carrying something much more complicated in private. And it's about the recognition that when he becomes king, he doesn't have to perform that acceptance anymore. He can build a household that reflects his own values, his own memory, his own understanding of what the monarchy should be. Charles reportedly didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, in that quiet study, with his glasses on the table and his hands folded, and looked at his son for what one source described as a long, long time. And when he finally spoke, he reportedly said only that he hoped William would think very carefully about what kind of king he wanted to be, and whether the first act of that reign should be the diminishment of a woman who had done nothing but love his father. Then he stood up, picked up his papers, and left the room. William reportedly stayed behind for a few minutes, alone, before he too got up and walked out into the long corridor that leads back to the courtyard where his car was waiting. The aftermath moved outward almost immediately. Within days, according to palace observers, coverage began to shift. Small items in the press about Camilla's reduced schedule. Speculation about which patronages she might hand over. Anonymous quotes from unnamed courtiers about the need for modernization. None of it explicit, none of it traceable, but the drumbeat was steady enough that Camilla's team reportedly recognized it for what it was. A soft repositioning. A gentle preparation of the public for a future in which the Queen's role becomes ceremonial rather than substantive. And the public reaction has been split, honestly, in ways that don't fall along the usual lines. Older citizens, particularly those who remember Diana clearly, have reportedly been more sympathetic to William than you might expect. For them, this feels like a long-delayed correction, a son finally asserting himself on behalf of a mother who never got the chance to defend herself. Younger demographics, meanwhile, have viewed it as unnecessarily cruel. To them, Camilla is not the villain of a 30-year-old scandal. She's an elderly woman who has served the country with quiet dignity, and stripping her of influence at this stage of her life feels petty rather than principled. There's a small human detail from all of this that reportedly landed harder than anything else. According to sources, Camilla was at an engagement recently, a literacy event, one of the causes closest to her heart. A young girl, no more than 9 or 10, reportedly presented her with a handmade card. On the front, the child had drawn a crown. Inside, in careful handwriting, she'd written that Camilla was her favorite queen. Camilla reportedly pressed the card to her chest, thanked the girl, and kept it with her for the rest of the day. An aide later said she placed it on her writing desk that evening, next to a photograph of Charles from earlier in their marriage. She didn't say anything about it. She just placed it there and turned out the light. That's the image that reportedly captures what this whole situation is really about. Because for all the talk of institutional architecture and streamlining and transition frameworks, what's actually at stake here is a woman at the end of a long, difficult journey, being told, quietly and firmly, that the story doesn't end the way she'd hoped, and a husband who loves her, watching from a position of diminishing power, unable to protect her from the son he raised. According to those close to the situation, this action was reportedly taken to protect the monarchy, not to punish Camilla. That's the frame William's team has consistently pushed, and it's worth taking seriously. Because if you strip away the personal dimension, there is a genuine institutional argument that the firm has become too large, too diffuse, too dependent on figures whose relevance to the modern public is fading. William reportedly believes that a smaller, more focused royal family is the only version that survives the next century, and in that vision, the Queen Consort's traditional role of enduring influence simply doesn't fit. But here's the thing. If that's true, then this isn't really about Camilla at all. She's just the first test case for a much larger restructuring, and everyone inside the palace knows it. What happens to her will set the precedent for what happens to Harry, to Andrew's daughters, to Edward's children, to every peripheral figure whose role has never been fully defined. That's why the reporting matters, and that's why the palace is watching this so carefully. Because whatever William does to Camilla, he will eventually do to everyone else who doesn't fit the streamlined vision. What this whole situation illuminates is the impossible tension at the heart of any monarchy. Duty and love pulling in opposite directions. Institution and family fighting for the same heir. A son honoring his mother by refusing to fully forgive the woman who replaced her. A father honoring his wife by trying to shield her from a future he cannot control. Two truths held at once, and no clean way to resolve them. And in the middle of it all, a small handmade card with a crown on the front, sitting on a writing desk beside a photograph from a happier time. Camilla reportedly still keeps it there. An aide said she looks at it sometimes, in the quiet moments before the day starts. She doesn't say anything about it. She just looks. And then she gets up and puts on her earrings and goes out to do the work she's always done, for however much longer they'll let her do it. Before we wrap up, if you want to stay updated on royal family news as it develops, make sure to subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.